This will be the fifth installment of No Talking by Andrew Clements. We're on chapter 13, The Language Lab. As his last class of the day came into Mr. Burton's room, he didn't speak. And of course, neither did the students. The bell rang, and all the kids watched him as he put a stack of lined paper on the front desk of each row. Then he turned to the chalkboard and began to write. Today, there will be writing only. Nothing will be turned in, but everyone must write all period long, and everyone must communicate with at least 4 other people. You may not stop writing for more than 15 seconds. As soon as you have paper, begin. In less than 1 minute, every kid had paper, and in less than 2 minutes, the first notes were changing hands. Todd wrote, "I still think this no talking thing is stupid," and he passed the paper to Kyle. Kyle read the note and wrote, "I sort of like it. It's different. A challenge." Then Todd wrote, "Challenge? What challenge? The teachers already know about it, like Mr. Burton. He's just messing with us. Thinks it's great we're not talking. I like talking." Kyle read, and he wrote back, "Too bad. Think how hard it is for all the blabby girls. We're going to win this contest. Beat the girls. Beat the girls. Beat the girls. Get it? It's a silent cheer like at a basketball game. Cool, huh?" Todd wrote back, "Cool? Dude, it's lame. Here's my silent cheer. Kyle's a dork. Kyle's a dork. Kyle's a dork." Kyle read the note, made a face at Todd, and then turned his back on him and started up a chat with Eric. No talking made it very simple to tune someone out. A few seats away, Emily was having a hot argument with Taryn. "I did not say you couldn't come over after school. I just said, what's the point if we can't talk? That's all." Taryn read the note, shook her head, and wrote, "I know you don't like me as much as you like Kelly. Stop pretending." Emily rolled her eyes and wrote, "Don't be like that." Taryn shrugged and wrote, "Like what?" Emily used block letters for emphasis, all sniffy and snoofy and ouchy. "I hate that." "See?" Taryn wrote, "Hate. That's what you said. You hate me." Emily scribbled, "Don't be an idiot. I don't hate you. Come over after school. Really. We'll think of something to do, but we're going to want to talk. I know we will, and we can't." And Taryn wrote back, "I'm not coming. You think I'm an idiot." Emily read that and then ripped the paper to pieces. She reached across the aisle and patted Taryn on the arm and smiled her warmest smile, and then wrote on a fresh sheet of paper, "After school, my house, okay?" Taryn smiled back and nodded. All around the room, kids were having to figure out the new rules for communicating. And for most of them, writing was a lot harder than talking. It was slower, like instant messaging, only less instant, and less fun because there was no computer to mess with. There was also much less give and take than there was with talking. The unshushables weren't used to that at all. David just finished a frustrating set of back and forth messages with Bill. Bill couldn't understand how to keep from getting called off sides during a soccer game. David explained it 3 different ways. He had drawn pictures and diagrams and everything, and Bill still couldn't figure it out. So Dave passed a note to Ed because he was the best junior league player in town. "Bill doesn't get the offsides rule. Help." Ed read the note, nodded at Bill, bent over his paper, and began writing. Dave looked around for a new partner, and he saw Lindsay was passing notes with Helena. They seemed to be having a great time, nodding a lot and cracking each other up. Probably gossiping, he thought, about something really stupid. He grabbed a clean sheet of paper and began a note to Lindsay. "What's the difference between you and a toxic waste dump?" But he decided that riddle was too harsh, even for Lindsay, even if it was true. He crumpled the paper and took another sheet. But before he started writing, he got up, walked to a bookcase, grabbed a dictionary. He flipped the pages and then ran his fingers down a column of words, and there it was. Um. Also spelled UMM, pronounced Interjection. Used to express doubt or uncertainty or to fill a pause when hesitating in speaking. So Lindsay had been right about something, for once. He sat back down and wrote, "Hey, Captain Burgess, how's the war going? Ready to surrender?" Dave nudged Jason, handed him a note, and pointed at Lindsay. Jason nudged Lindsay and held the note out to her. And when she glared at him, Jason shook his head and pointed back at Dave. Lindsay made a face and then took the paper, holding it between her thumb and forefinger like it was a squashed toad. She read the message, wrote a little, and nudged Jason, who passed the paper back to Dave. Her reply was, "It's General Burgess. Check the score, Dimbo. Girls rule, boys are losers. As usual, you're gonna get totally schooled." Jason handed the paper back to Dave. He read her message and made a snarly face at her, and then wrote, "Don't count on it. Always the big talker." And sitting there, frowning at the paper, once again Dave felt this overpowering wish that he could show Lindsay who was the boss, settle the question once and for all, really put her in her place. And in answer to his wish, an idea popped into his head, an idea he probably should have ignored, but he didn't. Pressing down hard with his pencil, Dave wrote, "How about you and me go head to head? Have our own special no-talking match. Starting right now, you and me, unless you're scared. And the winner gets to write a big L on the loser's forehead with permanent marker. On the playground after lunch on Thursday. How's that sound?" And he gave the paper to Jason. Lindsay grabbed the paper from Jason and read it. And there was no hesitation. She looked at Dave, nodded a big yes, held her hand up with her fingers making an L, and pointed at him. Then she wrote something and handed the paper to Helena, who read everything, wrote something, and passed the paper back to Lindsay, who wrote something more and passed the paper to Jason, who passed it to Dave. Lindsay had written, "Helena, you be the witness. Sign here." And Helena had written her name. And below Helena's name, Lindsay added, "No backing out now, fat mouth. Which color marker do you like best, red or black?" Dave pointed at her and pretended to laugh and laugh. She stuck out her tongue and then turned away and picked up her chat with Helena. Dave didn't feel like he'd lost that skirmish. Lindsay always had a way of firing the last cannonball. Dave felt like he'd lost that skirmish. Lindsay always had a way of firing the last cannonball. Then he smiled as he thought how much fun it would be to paint a big L on her forehead. If he could win, that is. Otherwise, Dave wouldn't have put his feelings into these exact words, but he sat there in the quiet room, sort of wishing he didn't have to be a war. Because it was interesting. Not talking was interesting all by itself, even without the extra fun of the contest and the extra risk of his new private battle with Lindsay. And he suddenly wondered what Lindsay thought about it, about the whole idea. And he wondered if she'd be honest enough to tell him. So Dave grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and wrote, "I'm kind of glad we're doing this, the no talking thing. Like, I really didn't know how was a word. It's pretty interesting. At least it is to me." Then he gave the paper to Jason. Jason tapped Lindsay's arm and handed her the new note. She read it and then gave Dave a short, suspicious look. And then she bent over the paper and wrote. Jason handed him the paper, and Dave read her message. It said, "It is to me, too. I'm thinking and thinking and thinking. Pretty amazing." Dave turned and caught Lindsay's eye, and they half nodded at each other. For one tiny fraction of a second, it wasn't boys against girls, and it wasn't a battle. It was two smart kids enjoying an idea. Jason handed Dave another note, from him this time. "I'm not your personal delivery boy. Maybe you and Lindsay should sit at the same desk. Ha ha ha." Dave's face felt hot. He scribbled, "You're crazy," onto Jason's note and jammed it back to him. At the bottom of the page he and Lindsay had passed, he wrote, "Hey, yeah, but no way you're going to win this fight. You and your stupid friends are going down. Big time." And as Dave tossed the note above Jason's head so it landed on Lindsay's desk. He made an ugly face at her and then shook his hands like he was trying to flip something gross off his fingers. He didn't wait for Lindsay's reaction. Dave turned away and began writing a new note to Scott. All during seventh period, Mr. Burton sat at his desk watching. He wrote some notes too, but they were notes to himself. No hesitation. Everyone jumped right in. Some frustration with writing, it's slow. Some anger displayed, a lot of nodding and gesturing, some hand signs. Tapping on desks and arms and shoulders to get attention, some poking too. Mouth sounds, tongue clips, lip popping raspberries, some animal sounds, quacking, whistling, barking, sometimes to get attention, sometimes to bother. Not much boy-girl or girl-boy note passing, but more than I'd expected from this group. A lot of smiling and frowning and other face-making. Not one single word out loud. Mr. Burton was taking a class at the State University 2 nights a week, studying for his master's degree. The course was called Human Development, and one of the topics they had studied was the way children learn to use language. Of course, this wasn't watching kids learn to use language. These students were already good with words, almost too good. No, this was watching students try to change how they express themselves, trying to use language in a new way. Mr. Burton was pretty excited. It was like having his own private lab, or language lab. He thought, if I keep careful notes, I bet I can write my big research paper on this. I can do interviews with the kids once they start talking again. I can gather information from the other teachers, too. So much good stuff to work with here. This is great. When the last bell rang, Mr. Burton was sorry the class had to end, and he couldn't wait for his first class on Wednesday morning. For the fifth graders, the last bell on Tuesday meant something. It meant they had to go ride a bus and not talk. The bell meant they had to go to sports practice or dance or music lessons and not talk. It meant they had to go home and deal with moms and dads and brothers and sisters and neighbors and everyone else and not talk. No one was sure how all this was going to work, including Dave. But Dave was absolutely sure of one thing. He was going to do everything just right, because if he messed up, it meant he'd be walking around school on Thursday afternoon with a big L on his forehead. And that was not going to happen. Chapter 14. Seen but not heard. The homebound school buses were quieter than usual on Tuesday afternoon, especially the ones hauling a large number of fifth grade kids. But none of the fifth graders found the ride home very hard. With no grown-ups around, it was pretty easy to keep quiet. A few of them sat with friends and passed notes back and forth. Some read books or opened a notebook or did homework. Most of the fifth graders just sat quietly, looking and listening and thinking. For the fifth graders like Lindsay, who stayed for soccer or field hockey or cross country, after school was just like regular school, because the coaches were all teachers, and you could answer teachers because of the 3-word rule. Everyone was getting pretty good at that part of the contest. Soccer practice was easy for Lindsay. Instead of yelling for the ball like she sometimes did, she just waved a hand or made a motion with her head to direct teammates to cover an area or move downfield. She pointed. Lindsay was good at soccer. She did most of her communicating with her feet. For the kids like Dave, who went right home after school, not talking was more difficult. A lot more difficult, because it's a fact of nature that parents don't like it when kids don't answer them. David had been home 5 minutes when he heard his mom come in the front door and call his name. He was upstairs in the bathroom. She called again, "David, answer me." To be more specific, Dave was sitting on the toilet. "David, answer me." Dave knew that tone of voice. He had to do something right away. He reached over and banged on the inside of the bathroom door. It was the wrong move. His mom was up those front stairs and had both hands on that locked bathroom door in 2 seconds. "David, is that you? Are you all right? David, answer me." She was going to kick down the door. Dave was sure of it. He jiggled the doorknob, flushed the toilet, and was up and zipped and buttoned all in about 2 seconds, and he yanked the door open and gave his mom his best smile he could manage. Mrs. Packer was so relieved that she bent down and hugged Dave so hard that he couldn't have said a word even if he wanted to, which he didn't. But then she held him out in front of her and gave him a stern look. "Didn't you hear me calling you?" It would have been easy to shake his head no and tell a lie, but Dave smiled and shrugged and held out his hands. Then he pointed to his mouth. His mom frowned even more. "Your throat? Is your throat sore? Is that it?" Dave shook his head. "But it's hard to talk? Something hurts? Should I call Dr. O'Hara's office? We can drive right over there." Dave shook his head again and motioned for his mom to follow him. He went to his room, then to his desk, and on a piece of paper he wrote, "Sorry. It's a thing we're doing at school, not talking for a couple days, that's all." His mom looked at the paper. "Not talking?" she said. "Don't be silly. Everybody has to talk." Dave smiled and shrugged, and he wrote, "Not all the time." His mom tilted her head back and made a face at him, nodding slowly. "Oh, so you're saying that I talk all the time. Is that it?" Again, Dave smiled and shrugged. "Because I could be as quiet as anybody," then she added, "if I wanted to." Bending over to pick up a sweatshirt, she pushed it into his arm and said, "Well, anyway, get the rest of these dirty clothes picked up and go downstairs and start a load in the washer. Only the dark colors, all right?" Dave made a face and she said, "And don't give me any of that sass, mister." At his karate class, Kyle did a front snap kick without a yell. Mr. Hudson bowed and said, "Kyle-san, always yell when you like this when you kick. Hee-yah! Now you." Kyle did the kick again, and he moved his face and mouth, but he didn't yell. Mr. Hudson's face got red, and he walked stiffly like he always did when he was displeased, but he was still being polite because that is the karate way. He bowed. "Kyle-san, did you not hear me?" Ben Ellis walked onto the mat and bowed to Mr. Hudson. He was in the 4th grade. When Mr. Hudson bowed back, Ben said, "Hudson-san, the 5th graders aren't talking. None of them." Hudson-san bowed and made a wise face and tried to imagine what the teacher in the movie The Karate Kid would say in this situation. And after a long pause, he said, "Ah, I see. Yes, silence. It is good." Then he bowed at Kyle-san, and Kyle-san bowed back. Then Kyle did another snap kick without yelling. Ellen played the first flute piece for her teacher, but there was a problem. Mrs. Lennox said, "All right, we're in 4/4 time here." She used her pencil to point at the quarter rest. "How many beats of silence do you allow for this rest?" Ellen tapped once on the music stand. Her teacher said, "Correct, but just say 1 beat." Then Mrs. Lennox pointed at the symbol for the whole rest. "How many beats for this one?" Ellen tapped 4 beats. "Just say 4 beats, dear." Ellen smiled and tapped 4 times, then pointed at her mouth and shook her head. "What?" asked Mrs. Lennox. Again, Ellen pointed at her mouth and shook her head. "Your lips." "Something about your lips?" asked her teacher. "Just tell me, dear." Ellen smiled and shook her head. Then she lifted the flute to her lips and played the piece again, and this time she read all the rests perfectly. Her teacher nodded, smiled, and then turned the page to the next piece. Before Ellen began to play, Mrs. Lennox pointed at each rest, and Ellen tapped out the right number of beats. The teacher nodded, and Ellen began to play. When she finished, Mrs. Lennox smiled, pointed at the start of the piece, picked up her own flute, nodded, and they played the whole piece again as a duet. Neither of them said a word for the rest of the lesson. Brian's mom picked him up at school, and when he got in the car, she said, "You need a haircut. We're stopping at Zeke's on the way home." Brian groaned and shook his head. He stamped his feet on the floor of the car. His mom kept driving. Brian hated going to Zeke's modern barbershop. Zeke was this grumpy guy who'd been cutting hair in Laketon for more than 40 years. He gave everyone the same haircut, short on top and buzzed close on the sides. But the last 2 times he'd been there, Brian had forced Zeke to do a halfway decent job, but only because he practically yelled at the man the whole time. Not so short on top. No, really, that's enough off the top. And don't use the clippers on the sides, just scissors. There, that's enough. Don't cut off any more, really. No, please, no clippers. Just use the scissors, please. And that's why today was the wrong day for a haircut. If Zeke got him into that worn out barber chair, Brian knew he'd end up looking like something that escaped from the zoo. When his mom parked the car, Brian jumped out and dashed into the pizza place next to the barber shop. But his mom followed him. He pointed at the menu, but she shook her head. There's no time for a snack. We have to pick up your sister in 15 minutes. She took him by the arm and pulled him out of the restaurant and over to Zeke's door. Now, get in there. Quick. There's no line right now. Brian wanted to say, Newsflash, Mom. There's never a line at Zeke's. The man's a rotten barber, and he has bad breath. But Brian couldn't say that. And he wouldn't be able to talk to Zeke either. He was doomed. 15 minutes later, when his big sister got into the car, she took one look at Brian and burst out laughing. She said, Zeke, right? Brian could only nod. He had paid a heavy price for keeping his mouth shut, but he kept his promise to Dave and the other guys. And if they didn't beat the girls, well, it wasn't going to be his fault. And he had the bad haircut to prove it. Was it worth it? Yeah, he thought. It was worth it. So what if I look like a monkey for a week or 2 or 3? Brian stared out the side window and tried not to think about it. Mrs. Burgess was worried. She glanced in the rearview mirror and looked at her daughter's face again and thought, did she have a horrible day at school? Is that what's bothering her? Or maybe something happened at soccer practice. That coach of hers can be pretty rough. About a month earlier, Lindsay had started riding in the back seat of the car instead of up front. Her mom had noticed that her bright, chatty little girl was starting to become more serious, sort of distant now and then. And today, not even a word and barely a nod as she got into the car after practice. Lindsay's mom thought, maybe she's giving me the silent treatment because I said she couldn't go to that sleepover at Kelly's this weekend. That's probably it. Kids can be so moody sometimes. Goodness knows I was. The truth is, Lindsay wasn't feeling moody at all. She was just thinking. Actually, she was thinking about thinking. Not talking all afternoon had made her realize something. For years now, she had done most of her thinking out loud. I've been just blurting out whatever's on my mind, to my sister, to my mom, and at school. I just go on, and then I talk on the phone all night. Incredible. Lindsay hated to admit it, but Dave Packer might have been right about the top of her head exploding, because that's how it had felt at first. She felt like a faucet that had been wide open, gushing and gushing forever, and then suddenly it flipped shut, and all her thoughts had been bottled up. But by the time school let out, Lindsay had started to enjoy the change. And all during soccer practice, she'd felt like she was alone, just her and her own voice. And she felt like saying, hi there, I'm Lindsay, remember me? I live here. Thinking and being quiet. It was different, and it was good. As the car turned onto their street, almost home, she looked up and saw her mom's eyes in the car mirror, and instantly felt how worried she was. So Lindsay gave her mom a wave and a big smile, and her mom smiled back. All over town, the other fifth graders were figuring out how to get along without talking. Were there any mistakes made on Tuesday afternoon? Yes, but only a few. Every single fifth grade girl and boy was working hard not to talk. And later on, as it got to be dinner time and family time and homework time and bedtime, there were other problems the kids faced. A phone call from grandma, a little brother who needed help with homework, a family trip to the mall for new shoes. Lots of situations that begged for spoken words. Every single kid had unusual experiences Tuesday night, and every single kid had to be creative and alert and quiet. But it's not time to tell about all that. It's time to go back to school. Back in time to about 3:30 on Tuesday afternoon. Back to the conference room next to the office, because that's where the principal and the fifth grade teachers had held a special meeting. And they had plenty to talk about.